Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying happy and healthy. I'm here with you today to go over some poetry notes. Now this is a little bit more of an extensive note set. You are going to be using links in Schoology, so if we were looking at our Schoology page, currently we're in week 13 and in activity 4 you can see the poetry notes. There are different folders and I will try and make sure that I do the timing as well as possible to remind you which folder you should be working in. You should also be using a poetry note set that looks like this through Google Docs. That'll also be linked in that Activity 4 folder. You should follow along in Edpuzzle and pause occasionally. And once again, I'll try and remind you every so often to pause and to go and fill in your notes. So that way we can reference these as we go and talk further about poetry and work on pathways involving poetry that can be linked to Kill a Mockingbird. Alright, so let's get started. Let's start off with what is poetry. Poetry is a type of literature that expresses ideas and feelings or tells a story in a specific form, usually using lines and stanzas. So right now, if you are looking at your note sheet, that would be at the very top, explaining what is poetry. The format of poetry. So when I talk about lines, I'm talking about a group of words together on one line of the poem. So as you can see by the arrows up here at the top, we have 3 lines. These 3 lines would then make up a stanza or a group of lines arranged together. So there would be 2 stanzas that each are composed of 3 lines, making a total of 6 lines right here. So let's talk a little bit about rhythm. Rhythm is best created by the sounds of the words in a poem. So rhythm can be created by using meter, rhymes, and alliteration. We learned about alliteration earlier when we did figurative language. So 99.9% of poems have some form of rhythm. Now that can change depending upon the poetry type, and we will get into that later. So at this point in time, please remember to fill in your notes. We're going to be moving on to meter. So meter is a pattern of stressed or strong and unstressed, meaning weak, syllables. Each unit or part of the pattern is called a foot. So there are different types of feet. This would be like iambic, which is unstressed and stressed, trophic, which is stressed and unstressed, empestic, unstressed, unstressed, and stressed, and dactylic, stressed, unstressed, unstressed. So when I'm asking you to reference meter, we're going to be talking about the strength of lines versus the weakness of lines as far as syllables. As important as meter is, it's a little bit more common to create rhythm in a poem using a rhyme scheme. So we're going to talk a little bit about rhyme. So as far as do poems need to rhyme? No, poetry does not need to rhyme. However, many poems do have a rhyme scheme. So a rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhyming words or sounds, usually end rhymes, but not always. Use the letters of the alphabet to represent sounds to be able to visually see the pattern. So when I say use the letter of the alphabets, I'm going to give you an example in just a moment. But once again, different poetry types that we are going to talk about at the end of the notes use different rhyme schemes. And some poetry types don't use rhyme or rhythm at all, meaning that they don't have any kind of form of meter. So let's talk rhyme schemes. Like I said before, it uses the letters of the alphabet. So if we look at this poem called The Germ, we can see that it has an A, B, C, A rhyme scheme. So a mighty creature is the germ, though smaller than the pachyderm. His customary dwelling place is deep within the human race. His childish pride is often pleases by giving people strange diseases. Do you, my poppet, feel infirm? You probably contain a germ. So this is just a rhyme scheme that is an end rhyme that uses the pattern A, B, C, A. in reference to end rhymes. So at this point, please make sure, if you have not been keeping up with documenting in your poetry notes what we have covered so far, pause the video, go fill in the notes, make sure that you are aware of the different types of rhyme scheme, because now we're going to start talking about end rhyme and the difference between end rhymes and internal rhymes. So an end rhyme is a word at the end of one line which rhymes with a word at the end of another line. So for another example, we have a rhyme scheme that is A, B, C, B, meaning that A and C do not rhyme, but the two lines that have B's on them do rhyme. So Hector the collector collected bits of string, collected dolls with broken heads and rusty bells that would not ring. So string and ring rhyme. So this gives it an A, B, C, B rhyme scheme. Next, let's look at internal rhymes. So these are rhymes that occur within the same line of the poetry. So you might notice with this poem that it has multiple rhyme schemes, and we'll get into that in a moment, but let's focus on the internal rhyme first. So once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, and as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. So you can see that there are a couple different forms of internal rhyme. We have dreary and weary, which would be our internal rhyme. We also have napping, tapping, rapping, and rapping, which would be an internal rhyme as well. We also have an end rhyme in the second and the fourth line with lore and door. So let's talk a little bit about literary elements as far as poetry. So we've already talked about author's purpose before, with it being either to amuse or to entertain, to persuade, or to inform. Poetry is a little bit special. The author's purpose is their reason for writing a literary piece. With that in mind, poetry can cross the line between to entertain and to inform, because the poem is trying to have a very creative and musical form to its informative message. So, author's purpose is very important in poetry. All poems, for the most part, are trying to assert some form of message. However, that message may cross lines between to persuade and to entertain, or to inform and to entertain. Let's talk about tone and mood. So tone is the author's attitude or feelings about the subject of their writing. Once you have documented the definition for tone in your notes, let's go over to our Schoology page. There's a blue folder for tone and a video where the author tells us why water is not wet. We're going to talk about tone in that video and in your notes and in this Edpuzzle. So if you go ahead, pause the Edpuzzle, go watch the video about tone, come back and answer a couple questions and document it in your notes. The next thing we're going to be talking about is mood. Mood is the feelings the piece is meant to inspire for the reader. So although tone is the author's feelings, mood is what you feel as a reader that you have been inspired to feel. So once again, if we go over to our Schoology page, in the red folder that says mood, there is a short video called The Present. I would like you to go watch that video after pausing the Edpuzzle, and then come back, answer some questions, and document it in your notes. Next, we're going to be talking about symbolism. Symbolism is an object that represents a deeper meaning or emotion. Symbols are used to describe the author's tone to a reader. So symbols usually embody something. For example, apples can symbolize different things in different stories or narratives. In each of these three stories, the apple represents something different. In the story of Adam and Eve, the story represents temptation, while in Snow White, the apple represents lies or treachery. In Newton's story about gravity, the apple represents inspiration and growth of knowledge. So although it is the same symbol in all three stories, it represents something different, inherent to the narrative of the story. Now we're going to be moving on to styles of poetry. There are several different styles of poetry. Some are more common in modern literature than others. So we're going to be starting off with lyrical poems. So make sure that you are documenting this in your notes. Each style of poem has its own box in the notes. Lyrical poems are short poems, only a few lines, 3 to 4 stanzas, usually written in first-person point of view. They express an emotion or an idea. Does not tell a story and is often musical. So Shakespeare wrote a large number of sonnets, and so this is just one of his. This is just the beginning of it. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So Shakespeare in this poem, I would like you to tell me what his tone is as far as the concept of love. Acrostic poems. These are poems that are pretty commonly found on greeting cards or sympathy cards. They are short poems that the first letter of each line forms a word or phrase vertically. An acrostic poem can describe the subject or even tell a brief story about it. So this acrostic poem on the screen is for April. It's after an extensive winter. Pretty tulips rise from the once icy ground, bringing fresh signs of life. So it spells out April. So in your notes, I'd like you to go ahead and practice doing an acrostic poem. Next, we're going to be talking about haikus. So a haiku is a Japanese-style poem written in 3 lines. It focuses traditionally on nature, but not always, and the lines are structured as such. Line 1 is 5 syllables, line 2 is 7 syllables, line 3 is 5 syllables, giving a total of 17 syllables. This is an example, and there is something wrong with this example, and I'd like you to determine what it is and correct it. My breakfast today, bacon, eggs, and lemon water. I feel so healthy. So go ahead in the Edpuzzle, try and figure out what seems to be wrong with the example, and go ahead and try and correct it. Please document it also in your notes. So if we are looking back at that example, it has 5 syllables in the first line, which is great. The second line has 8 syllables, which is wrong. It should have 7. And the third line has 5, which is great. So if we were going to correct it, we need to change the second line to have 7 syllables. So maybe change lemon to ice water, so that way we can have 7 instead of 8 syllables in the second line, for a total of 17 syllables to make it a haiku. Next, let's talk about limericks. Limericks are short poems, sometimes humorous, poems consisting of 5 lines. So in the highlighted, you can see that lines 1, 2, and 5 have 7 to 10 syllables and rhyme. Lines 3 and 4 have 5 to 7 syllables and also rhyme. So the highlighted red lines are to rhyme, and the black lines 3 and 4 are also to rhyme. There is something also wrong with this example. I'd like you to figure out what seems to be wrong for our limerick here, which is Tim wore rubber bands on his wrists for each item on his to-do list. But the more he forgot, the bigger it was, so now it's a big rubber fist. So I'd like you to figure out what is wrong with our limerick example and fix it.